Today's notes are all about communicable diseases. So, as we begin, let's think about our objectives for the day. We're going to be able to define what a communicable disease is, should be able to list and describe the most common types of pathogens that cause communicable diseases, and should be able to describe methods through which those pathogens are passed from person to person or organism to organism. So let's start with communicable diseases. If a disease can be spread from one person to another, we call that disease communicable. Communicable diseases are caused by things called pathogens. These are viruses, microscopic organisms, basically things we can't see, but that are still capable of making us sick. There are many different types of pathogens, but we are going to discuss just 4 of the most common. 3 of them fit into the kingdoms, but one of them is not considered living, and so it won't fit into one of the kingdoms. The first one we're going to talk about is bacteria. Bacteria are microscopic, unicellular organisms, but what separates them from other microscopic unicellular organisms is that they don't have any internal organization. So they don't have a nucleus, they don't have organelles, they don't have a lot of the internal structures that set other unicellular organisms apart. Bacteria get kind of a bad rap. A lot of people only think about bacteria as pathogens, but there are actually many helpful bacteria. They are decomposers primarily, so you'll find tons of bacteria in the soil doing good things and sometimes harm. You'll also find bacteria in your gut because we don't have all of the mechanisms we need to help us break down food. A lot of our food breakdown is done by bacteria as well, so you actually can't survive without the bacteria in your gut. However, there is a more dangerous side to bacteria. They cause a large number of diseases. Some common ones that you may have heard of: tetanus, so this is caused by bacteria in the soil; tuberculosis, pneumonia, meningitis, typhoid fever, cholera, strep throat, which is one that you may have run into a time or two, leprosy, which you probably haven't run into, and then, of course, your sexually transmitted diseases of syphilis and gonorrhea are also caused by bacterial infections. So there is a wide range of communicable diseases that can be passed from person to person that are caused by bacteria. There are also unicellular organisms called protists. They're from the protist kingdom, and they are similar to bacteria in that they're usually unicellular and they're microscopic, so they can't be seen. But unlike bacteria, they have more organization inside their cells. So slightly different from bacteria, but for the purposes of communicable diseases, very similar. Protists require a moist environment in order to reproduce. So if you're going to get an infection from a protist, it's most likely that you got it by consuming water that had the protist in it. So that's why you'll see some of these diseases you can get from consuming contaminated water. Additionally, they live in moist areas of your body, like in your body fluids. So if fluids are transferred, then you can have this communicable disease transferred as well. So there's not a ton of human diseases caused by protists, but the ones that are affecting humans affect them very seriously. So for example, malaria is a disease caused by a protist. These plasmoids that get into your blood and they actually infect your red blood cells and cause your red blood cells to burst, and you get very sick due to that. And then if you get bitten by a mosquito, then the mosquito takes those plasmoids and they deposit them into the next person that they bite. And that is how malaria is transferred. If you want to see a more in-depth explanation of malaria, you can look on page 611 of your textbook. It has a really great diagram and an explanation behind the transfer of malaria. African sleeping sickness is another pretty serious disease caused by a protist, as well as amoebic dysentery. So dysentery is a disease that causes you intestinal distress, causes you to lose a lot of fluids, but there's different varieties of it, and the one that's caused by an amoeba, amoebic dysentery, amoebas are a type of protist, so it is caused by a protist. Next up is the fungus kingdom. Fungus are single-celled or multicellular organisms that are primarily decomposers. The most common fungus that most people have heard of is mushrooms, but molds also fall into this category. So primarily in nature, fungi serve as decomposers. They help break down dead things and return their nutrients to the soil. So they serve, like bacteria, a very useful purpose. But just like bacteria, when they infect your body, they can do damage to you. They're responsible, however, for a very low percentage of diseases. Most of the diseases caused by fungus are not common in humans, and the ones that are common tend to be less serious, and in fact, they usually affect only the skin layer. So you have probably heard about athlete's foot. That is an infection caused by a fungus, and ringworm is also an infection caused by a fungus. People often still think that the reason you get the ring shape is because there is a worm under your skin, but that's not accurate. That's what we used to believe, which is where ringworm gets its name, but we now understand that it's really just a fungus causing damage to your body's cells, and it appears in that ring pattern on your skin. There is San Joaquin Valley fever, which has a very long scientific name that I am not going to try and pronounce for you. And that one would be funguses carried on pieces of dust and dirt and sand that people inhale, and then the fungus affects their lungs. So that would be one of the more serious diseases caused by funguses, but it's not very common. In fact, it's named after the valley where we have had the most cases of it. So if you're not in a place where these fungus cells are on pieces of sand and dust, you're likely not going to contract this one. The last type of pathogen we need to talk about is a virus. Viruses, like protists and bacteria, are very small microscopic particles, but we aren't going to call them unicellular because they aren't made of cells, which is one of the reasons that they are not considered to be alive. Viruses can't carry out any of the life processes that living things can. Like they can't grow, they can't move, they don't undergo cellular respiration. So if you don't go through all of these processes that living things go through, then we don't consider you living. So most scientists don't consider viruses to be alive. So you may say to yourself, well, if this thing isn't alive, then how can it damage me? Well, viruses possess one very important thing, which is that they do have genetic material. So they can have DNA or RNA inside their little capsule, their little particle. And what they do is, because they can't reproduce on their own, but they still need to reproduce, they use a living cell to reproduce. And in doing that, they damage the living cell. So what they do is they land on the exterior of a living cell, they inject their genetic material into the living cell, and then they use the cell's equipment to make lots and lots of copies of the virus, to make all these new little capsules with new DNA inside of them. And then, when they've produced enough of them, they burst the living cell open, which damages that cell. And if you have enough cells in your body that are being burst open and damaged by the virus, then that starts to damage your tissues. And then your body is going to respond in order to try and kill the virus that is damaging you. And in doing so, it's going to produce a lot of those symptoms that we perceive as being sick. Things like a fever, vomiting, those types of things are your body's response to try to eject this pathogen that's causing you damage. Viruses are the cause of many different diseases that exist in humans. So you're going to see a lot of things on this list that are pretty common, things like the common cold. So if you've ever just caught a sniffle, that was caused by a virus. Influenza, which we call the flu. Rabies, smallpox, herpes, chickenpox, measles, mumps, hepatitis, infectious mononucleosis, warts, and acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, which you may know as AIDS. All of these diseases are caused by a virus. So now that we know what pathogens exist, let's talk about ways that pathogens spread, because no matter what the pathogen is, the methods of spreading them are often very similar. Now, obviously, some methods don't work for others, right? So protists require moist environments to stay alive, so some of these methods might not keep them moist enough and wouldn't work for them, and so on. So not every single one of these methods of transfer works for every pathogen, but they work for a lot of them. They can be spread from organism to organism in the following ways. Through water. So if water becomes contaminated with a bacteria, a protist, a virus, etc., then if you drink that water or you swim in that water and some of it gets in your mouth or in your nose or in your eyes or in an open cut, then that pathogen has direct access to your body and it can now infect you. Vectors. Vector is the scientific word we use to describe anything that's alive that can transfer a pathogen. So usually when we talk about vectors, we're talking about insects that feed on blood because that's the easiest way to pass this. But vectors could also be, a dog that bites you. So if the dog has rabies, it can pass that to you via a bite. So vectors, living things, can pass pathogens. Contaminated inanimate objects. So anything not living that can become contaminated with a virus, and then you can touch that contaminated thing and get the virus or bacteria or whatever off of it. So things like doorknobs and toys, food, your blood can be contaminated, and if that gets on a surface or on a needle that was injected into you, then if that needle sticks someone else, the pathogen can be transferred that way, which is why if you are in a hospital and they stick you with a needle, you notice they're very careful with how they handle those needles because we don't want any accidental needle sticks where you've already poked someone with this needle to give them a vaccine and now you accidentally poke yourself and there's a possibility of pathogens being exchanged that way. Direct contact. This seems like a no-brainer. If you touch someone, bite someone, or get bit by something, kiss someone, have sexual contact with someone, all of those exchange body fluids and can result in you transferring a pathogen. And then, of course, the air. Pathogens can be spread through the air either in droplets, like from a sneeze or a cough, or they can be spread on dust in some cases. So lots of different ways that pathogens can be passed from person to person or organism to organism. It's not always human to human. This is where our notes end for today. Your homework is going to be questions 1 through 4 on page 615 of your textbook.